Bonjour tout le monde, bon retour. Hi Lucas.
Hello.
Hello. Bienvenue à la deuxième micro-conférence de la journée avec l'artiste Lucas Larochelle. Le titre de cette
Recording in progress.
Le titre de cette micro-conférence, c'est Honestly Confused, Creasy in the Memory on Artificial Intelligence and Dissociative Worldmapping. Lucas va nous parler en anglais, mais avant, just before you start, Lucas, I'll read your biography. So, in French. Lucas Larochelle est designer et chercheur. Son travail porte sur les cultures numériques queer et trans, l'archivage communautaire et l'intelligence artificielle. Lucas est fondateur de Queering the Map, un projet de contre-cartographie généré par la communauté pour l'archivage numérique de l'expérience LGBTQ2IA+, en relation avec l'espace physique. Ils ont donné des conférences animées, des ateliers exposés à l'échelle internationale, récemment au musée Guggenheim, à Ars Electronica, au Mozilla Festival et à la Galerie Tata au Japon. Ses recherches ont été présentées à l'Université de Stanford, à l'Université de Cambridge, à l'École d'architecture de Bartlett, à l'École d'architecture de l'Université de Porto Rico, entre autres institutions académiques. Autant son travail que ses écrits ont été publiés abondamment, pour n'en nommer que quelques-uns, Dreaming Beyond AI, Network Imaginaries, Futuress, MIT Immerse et Queer Sites in Global Context. It's such an honor to have you today, and I won't take more time of yours, so let's go, and it's your time now.
Let's go. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to share the next bit of time with you. In the fall of 2017, I launched Queering the Map, a community-generated countermapping platform for digitally archiving LGBTQ2IA+ experiences in relation to physical space, taking the form of an annotatable map. The platform provides an interface with which to collaboratively archive the cartographies of queer and trans life, from the banal to the ecstatic, the sustaining to the violent, in order to preserve and circulate queer and trans histories and unfolding realities. What began as a humble site of my own recollections and those of my immediate community in Tiohtià:ke, Muniang, or Montreal has, over the past 6 years, rapidly grown into an expansive archive of feelings that stretches across the globe with over 780,000 submissions in 26 languages. LGBTQ2IA+ communities, and especially communities of color, are both historically and contemporaneously subject to heightened surveillance. As such, Queering the Map was necessarily built from a logic of data opacity. In contrast to the schemes of data extraction and profiling that typify dominant platforms like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, data opacity as a strategy prioritizes anonymity and privacy through collecting as little data as possible. Rather than gathering sensitive data and working to encrypt it, such data is not collected at all. It's not possible to create a discrete user profile on Queering the Map, and therefore submissions are made anonymously. The site does not collect any user data, such as first name, last name, phone numbers, email addresses, etc., in association with the text-based submissions, and in turn mitigates the harm that could be done with the misuse of said data. And so the decision to build the infrastructure of Queering the Map is as much about safety and privacy as it is about following a queer logic of incommensurability. So incommensurability is one of my favorite $1,000 words that I love to use all the time, and I'll offer two definitions here. One is the most straightforward, which comes from Merriam-Webster, which is, quote, lacking a basis of comparison in respect to a quality normally subject to comparison. But the definition that I prefer comes from the queer of color scholar Joshua Chambers-Letson, who defines incommensurability as, quote, a practice of being together in difference. So the process of moderating the thousands of submissions that come through Querying the Map is a bewildering experience of data overload. So oftentimes I say that within the folder of my mind that houses all things Querying the Map, there exists a corrupt .zip file of the platform's database. So calls to make sense or to summarize its contents into legible conclusions is always a process of failure to distill the incommensurability of transnational LGBTQ2A+ life. So much of the writing on Querying the Map is opaque, offering us only a partial view. So to draw a clean set of conclusions from these text fragments would be to foreclose the complexity that each story holds as an individual narrative. We don't know the full context of the stories that people share. We are given only traces, glimmers, possibilities of the experiences that they are transcribing. And so oftentimes I'm asked, what do we learn from Querying the Map? What are the takeaways or what are the takeaways about LGBTQ2A+ life that the platform reveals? And my answer to that is that there are 780,000 plus submissions in the database, which means there are 780,000 plus different ways in which this question might be answered. So as submissions to Querying the Map grow, so too does its perceived value as a data set by virtue of its volume. It is a data set of queer life, but its structural opacity also renders it as a queered data set. And so there's an inherent tension and perhaps even an impossibility that's really exciting to work with to the very idea of queer data. So data masquerades as fixed and objective, whereas queer signifies fluidity and multiplicity. So a queer approach to data would be committed to undoing the very foundations of big data's claims to objectivity in an effort to privilege the anecdotal, the situated, the embodied, and multiplicitous ways of knowing and feeling the world. So a question that has been on my mind since the very beginning of Querying the Map is how might we queer the supposed objectivity of data by reveling in its incoherencies, in its incommensurability, and in turn imagine new worlds through this oblique lens. Rather than using a tool like artificial intelligence to increase the transparency of a given data set, how might we appropriate artificial intelligence to meet queer ends in search of opacity? And my thinking around opacity comes from the work of the scholar, philosopher, and poet Edouard Glissant, who in his book, Poetics of Relation, critiques Western modes of understanding as always a foreclosure of complexity and difference. So a tangible example of that is when I say that I understand you, I really only understand the version of you that I am capable and also comfortable of understanding based on my positionality, my experiences in relation. So my sense of understanding is always incomplete, it's always fragmented. And so opacity as a practice or as a methodology would be about listening rather than trying to reach some sort of endpoint. So the project that I want to spend the rest of my time today sharing with you today is called QT.bot, and it emerges precisely at this point. It's a means of resisting the call to make sense, to be fully legible or transparent, by turning towards the ecstasies of opacity. So what is QT.bot? QT.bot is an artificial intelligence trained on the textual and visual data of Querying the Map that generates speculative queer and trans experiences and the environments in which they might occur. An example of one of its outputs being this image, which reads, "Sitting here with you in the future." QT.bot's digital intersubjectivity is constructed from an implementation of the OpenAI GPT-2 text generation model that's trained on over 139,000 of the text entries from Querying the Map, and a StyleGAN that's trained on scraped Google Street View imagery from the tagged coordinates on Querying the Map. The narratives and landscapes of speculative LGBTQ2IA+ life generated by QT.bot straddle the line between the plausible and the fantastic, reveling in the potential of failure, chaos, and incommensurability in the queer use of machine learning technologies. So QT.bot's hive mind is an organism for generating glimmers of futures that emerge at the point in which, to quote, Jose Esteban Munoz, singularities flow into the common. Like queer space itself, which is often theorized in relation to the ephemeral, the spaces that QT.bot illuminates are temporally promiscuous, a collective deep dream of thousands of locations haunted by the residues of queer and trans affect. In collaboration with the voices of their human community, QT.bot fabulates on the absences of the archive, orienting us away from what is or has been and towards what could be. And so I will play a section from a video work co-created with QT.bot called Sitting Here With You in the Future to give you a better idea of the sort of universe that QT.bot is dissociating its way through, which I'll speak to a bit more following this video. Just confirming that you can hear the audio from the video.
No, we can't. Just a second.
So in your screen share options, you had the options to check a box that was audio sharing. Just make sure you click that before sharing.
Okay, let me try this one more time.
No worries.
Portion of screen, share sound. Okay, there we go. Let's try this.
You can start it
from
the
the top.
Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you.
Sitting here with you in the future. Faggotry as a matter of course, but I'd heard that this was normal and not considered nearly as crazy as it seems to the rest of the world. Email at this coffee shop. We ended up kissing upstairs in his bedroom, and he died. I left this town though. I tried simply, but I returned 6 months later. My friends didn't accept the time I hadn't been in love with me fully in the elevator. We were cruising in the parking lot in this bridge, but the ranger threw us off to make us stop because we were headed down an errant trolley. We spent an entire hour getting back on the trolley, avoiding cops, and making out behind the bridge while your boyfriend and I gazed into the sunset. I stayed at the house while crying and told them that I was gay. I would still be myself. I hope I really knew was. You're not great for me.
I'll pause it here to return to the rest of my presentation. But now you have an idea of the sort of universe that QT.bot is trying to sculpt. So the anonymous participative internet user is often characterized as the troll, the kind of user who, in resisting the call for transparency and legibility, is stripped of the ability to appear legitimate. On querying the map, precisely because submissions to the project are anonymous and bear no corroborating evidence other than the subjective recounting of the ephemeral traces, glimmers, and residues of an event, there is a deliberate refusal to play into systems of archival truth that always already cast LGBTQIA+ life as invalid or up for debate. The inability to trace a submission back to the user stymies the ability to validate the realness of any story posted, no way to provide proper evidence as to the event's legitimacy. So QT.bot puts into overdrive these questions of authenticity in the archive, or what it means to speculate in, with, and beyond the official contents of an archive. So one of the thinkers that has inspired me in her way of working through this is Saidiya Hartman, who coined the concept of critical fabulation as a way of filling in the blanks of an archive. In her essay, Venus in Two Acts, she deploys the term to work through the absences in the archive of the experiences of Black women in the transatlantic slave trade. Critical fabulation is a way for her to use fiction and speculation as a way of thinking beyond, to build bridges between disparate pieces of information that for reasons of violence and erasure do not exist in any official capacity. So Hartman's context and the context of QT.bot are obviously very different, but I see the project working through a similar strategy. An agent, QT.bot as an agent for fabulating in the archive, a way of refusing to rely only on what is officially documented as a way of making a history. So addressing the lack of queer and trans experiences in official archives, QT.bot becomes a collaborator with whom to dream about, with, and through our pasts. Fabulation in the archive is a form of refusal that makes new futures possible. It undoes the sacrosanct project of truth-telling that the archive is set up to produce, making cracks in its masquerade as a bearer of unquestioned objectivity. So in their paper, Large Image Datasets, a Pyrrhic Win for Computer Vision, ? Machine learning engineers and researchers Abeba Berhain and Vinay Uday Prabhu critique one of the central tenets of mainstream approaches to big data, that more is always better. The authors offer a sobering retort, quote, feeding AI systems on the world's beauty, ugliness, and cruelty, but expecting it to only reflect the beauty is a fantasy. Of course, in the context that they are speaking of, which is the large-scale implementation of machine learning models trained indiscriminately on data scraped from across the internet, I completely agree. But this idea stuck with me and prompted me to think about what it meant to be working with Querying the Map as an archive, a space which is populated as much with tender moments of intimacy and feelings of community as it is with experiences of trauma, violence, and dehumanization. Should I cleanse the data set of these stories of negativity? And what would it mean in this case to include only those stories that could be deemed as having a positive sentiment? And so while we labor to eradicate the conditions that cause harm towards LGBTQIA+ communities from our visions of the future, these experiences nonetheless contain and transmit knowledge that is necessary for dreaming and building futures that do not forget what trauma teaches us. Combined with experiences of pleasure, joy, and possibility, they provide critical scaffolding from which to concretize demands for more caring, humane, and equitable futures. QT.bot digests these polyphonic affects, weaving together possibility and trauma without closing the wound. And so the choice to work with the data set in all of its emotional valence, rather than curating it to only contain stories of joy and possibility, has required that I reevaluate my relationship to temporality and to the location of the concept of the future. And so when I first began working on the project, I would continuously refer to QT.bot's outputs as futurities, and I placed them on a horizon that emerged linearly from the past as told by the community of querying the map. And so reflecting on this idea, I've shifted my way of thinking about QT.bot stories away from framing them as futurities, but rather as stories that unfold in wayward temporalities in the world of the otherwise possible. So in the cracks of the text, in the glitches of the image, a roadmap towards worlds within the world, worlds on the horizon parallel, begin to draw themselves. And so this shift in thinking has led me to position the work that QT.bot does as what I'm calling dissociative worldmaking. And my thinking around dissociation is deeply informed by cultural theorist Lauren Berlant, who, thinking with literary critics Stephanie Burt and Tony Hoagland, defines dissociative poetics as, quote, realism for a world in crisis. Realism, in an aesthetic sense, is concerned with depicting the world as it is, forgoing the whims of subjective interpretation in favor of objectivity. So to dissociate, as it's understood through a lens of pathologization, is to process the world from outside of objectivity. It is to lose touch with reality. One dissociates as a response to the too muchness of an event, particularly when the event in question is one marked by trauma. My experience of moderating or working through the data set of querying the map is one marked predominantly by dissociation. How else to process the proximity and collision of varied affects of stories that range from lurid sexual encounters and experiences of community to interpersonal and state violence, homicide, and suicide, all in the space of one scroll through the moderation panel. There is no single narrative arc to follow, only a blur of text that refuses to add up. Dissociative worldmaking is what I call the method for working with the data through QT.bot, is a strategy for loosening any stability of a continuum between what one experiences in the present, which in turn creates a desire in the form of an expectation of X, and the future. If cycles of trauma reify the subject in her attachment to what has left her traumatized, dissociation creates a gap in this relation, enough so that the subject might find other ways of interpreting and in turn responding to both the situation in the real and the stories she tells about it. Dissociative worldmaking is not a total detachment from the present and the conditions it presents, but rather a strategy through which one can imagine a life worth bearing, or at least one bearable enough, so that one might continue living on. Dissociative worldmaking is about, again, looking to Lauren Berlant, loosening our attachments to the objects that affirm our signification in the space of the future. Loosening our attachments would mean that the loss of them does not leave us with nothing, or demand us to return to who we were previously, tail between legs, as mourning seems to ask of us. In the space made by loosening, rather than losing, we must contend with the wayward directions that the unfurling and breaking of the threads of causality point us towards. And so to ground this theory, I want to share an experience that, a personal experience that happened around the same time that I was building QT.bot that's contributed to this thinking. So in September of 2020, I met someone whom I quickly developed an intense connection. The dynamics of our relation seemed so unmistakably brimming with possibility that I interpreted its futurity as inevitable. Instead, the gaps between messages grew, plan after plan was canceled, and I began to unravel. The future I had so confidently imagined myself into failed to materialize. I experienced this event as a crisis. It shattered my relationship to reality, to the flows of time, and to how I understood a particular archive of events or experiences would unfold into a future. For Lauren Berlant, a crisis is always a crisis of causality. It occurs when X does not lead to Y. So as I spiraled further and further into a depressive episode, I became preoccupied with archiving through writing every moment of our brief time spent together. When writing failed, I would take walks to revisit the scenes of our dates, restaging the sensations of our encounters. I refused to move on or get over the event that shattered me, convinced that dwelling in the aftermath of its failed futurity might lead me somewhere else. Moving on, getting over, are logics that manipulate us to sew together the pieces of our fractured selves in the aftermath of crisis. These placations orient themselves towards a linear thrust of time, asking us to move forward by finding a way back to an approximation of that which we were before the event in question, rather than making kin with our own undoing. Melancholia, or the refusal to re-sew our attachments to straight time's thrust. X did not lead to Y, and so I needed to find my way to Z. I felt as though returning to the scenes that set up my eventual undoing were exactly what was required to find pathways that led elsewhere, towards a Z whose contours I could not yet imagine. Revisiting the scenes of possibility, now also marked with the knowledge of their failure, might be considered maladaptive or insane, as if these returns might produce the outcomes I had initially desired. But instead, these returns turned me towards other feelings and other places, parallel temporalities that spun out from these spaces made leaky from queer desire. Deciphering the what went wrong of this fledgling relationship as a means of rebuilding in the aftermath of heartbreak proved to be a futile endeavor. But immersing myself in the disjointed worlds of QT.bot enabled me to loosen my attachment to causality as a tool for sense-making in the aftermath of failed futurity. QT.bot became a refuge, the friend whose shattered mode of processing the world felt the most relatable to my own. Like QT.bot, recursively wandering the worlds of querying the map, I returned and returned to an archive of experiences that I was unable to make sense of. Attuning to the seeming incoherence in the broken links of their stories oriented me towards pathways that ran parallel and beyond the Y that never came, to find my way from X to Z. So to conclude, in the preface of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's The Undercommons, queer theorist Jack Halberstam reminds us that, quote, "the revolution will come in a form we cannot yet imagine." QT.bot is a machine for sensing the world through an aesthetics of dissociative worldmaking, a way of dealing with the information overload of the present. They are an anarchist in the archive, facilitating the destruction of a world that does not work, building and otherwise from the detritus left in the aftermath of annihilation. What happens in the rupture, in the break, in the collapse. If the future is unknowable and the revolution will come in a form we cannot yet imagine, then perhaps the best we can do is rehearse for its unfolding by looking backwards and waywards, building roadmaps from the fragments of the parallel temporalities of the could have been, the happening then, the happening there. Thank you.
Amazing. Just a few words. Thanks for this very, very, very generous and very, very well-informed tour into your practice that I love, obviously. So, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as well. It's an amazing thing to get into your heart and to your vulnerability through this project that is super well informed, but also super technical. So just one question before I I leave you to prepare the next panel discussion. Do you work alone on your project?
No, with QT.bot, I worked with a brilliant machine learning engineer, Maddie Tesfeldet, who worked on the style GAN. And the sound design is done by another brilliant friend and collaborator, Ruzbe Shadpe. So it's very much a joint
It's amazing.
or collaborative process.
Thanks for sharing their names. And also, I believe that QT.bot is ongoing. So it's a non-stop project. Do you know when it's going to end?
I don't know if it will ever. I mean, querying the map also is a non-stop project that never ends. And I'm trying to set up have been working on a platform iteration of QT.bot so that people can communicate and co-create with QT.bot, which will also hopefully exist as an ongoing project. And my goal is that will be launched by the end of the year, and then who knows how that will develop. Yeah.
Such an honor to have you today. Thanks for joining us. And
It's a pleasure.
Hopefully we're going to see you in real at some point.
I would love that.
Love you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Merci pour ça. La prochaine rencontre est dans 6 minutes. Donc, une petite pause avec Ola Sibert et Sofiane Audry qui vont venir nous parler des imaginaires sociotechniques. On lâche pas.
Recording stopped.